All right, so we're starting with this picture. And chapter 2 is called Apples and Mrs. Stetson. Did we say something about apples when we read the back of the book?
No.
I think we did. That's okay. Soup.
Yes.
Soup was my best pal. His real and righteous name was Luther Wesley Vinson, but nobody called him Luther. He didn't like it. I called him Luther once, which prompted Soup to break me of a very bad habit before it really got formed. As soon as the swelling went out of my lip, I called him Soup instead of Thoop. He first discouraged his mother of the practice of calling him Luther, using a different method, of course. He didn't hit his mother. You know. She used to call him home to mealtime by yelling, Luther! But he never answered to the name. He'd rather miss supper. When his mother got wise, she'd stand out on their back porch, cup her hands to her mouth, and yell, Soup's on! From a distance, their farm was an up road next to ours. All you could hear was Soup. And that was how the kids who were playing ball in the pasture started thinking his name was Soup, because he answered to that. When it came to getting the two of us in trouble, Soup was a regular genius. He liked to whip apples, but that was nothing new. Every kid did. The apples had to be small and green and hard, about the size of a golf ball. The whip had to be about 4 to 5 foot long, with a point at the small end, and that you'd whittle sharp with your jackknife. You held the apple close to your chest with your left hand and pushed the pointed stick into the apple, but not so far as it'd come out the yonder side. So he's got a stick with a point, and he's taking the apple and putting it on top of the stick, right?
I want another one.
Okay.
It's so good.
Does that understand? Okay. Yeah, but no matter how careful you speared the apple, a few drops of juice would squirt in your shirt. They dried to small, tiny brown spots that never ever came out in the wash. Sassafras made the best whips. You could swing a sassafras whip through the air so fast it would whistle. So then they would take the stick and they would go like this. And what would happen? The apple would fly off. The apple would fly off, and you'd think it would never come down. To whip an apple was sport enough for most of us, but not for old Soup. Watch this, he said. What? I said. We were up in the apple orchard on the hillside that overlooked town. Below us was the Baptist church. I bet I can hit the Baptist church. You better not, Soup. Why not? We'll really catch it. No, we won't. And what's more, I bet this apple can hit the bell in the bell tower and make it ring. It won't go that far. Oh, no. Soup whipped his apple, and I was right. It landed far short of the Baptist church. Watch me, I said. And with my next throw, I almost hit the church roof. My turn, said Soup. I'll have to admit that Soup put all he had into his next throw. The whip made a whistle that would have called a dead dog. That old apple took off like it'd been shot out of a gun, made a big arc through the sky, and for a few long seconds, I thought we'd hear that old bell ring for sure. But we never heard the sounding of brass. What we heard was the tinkling cymbal of a broken window. Breaking a pane of plain old glass wasn't stylish enough for Soup. It had to be stained glass. Church windows. Even the sound of that stained glass shattering had color in it. I just stood there looking at that tiny little black star of emptiness that was once a window pane. It was like somebody busted my heart. No, I said in almost a whisper. I wanted the glass to fly up into place like it never happened, but so that the little black star would erase away like a bad dream. But there it was, and there it stayed. No, said Soup. My feet were stuck to the ground like I was standing in a twin buckets of mortar. It's like tar. I couldn't run, not even when a lady ran out of the side of the church and pointed at us. Even though she was far below, it felt like her finger took a stab right into my chest. It was a pain just like when you get stuck with the tip of a sword. To make matters worse, it was Mrs. Stenson. My family wasn't Baptist, but I guess that she knew Mama and Aunt Carrie real well because she came to call almost every week. Religion was her favorite subject. You'd be hard put to find a soul who knew more about God than Mrs. Stenson. She was a walking, talking Bible, which she could quote chapter and verse, get her started, and it went on like rain, 40 days and 40 nights. That's an illusion. You were just looking at the poster of an illusion being how you refer to a well-known story or piece of history. What is 40 days and 40 nights referring to?
A very common blend of days in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Moses in the desert.
Yeah.
It's a bunch of things.
There's a lot of stuff.
Jesus in the desert, Moses in the desert.
There-
When they were on the ark.
The ark was 40 days and 40 nights.
Wait, Moses wasn't the one in 40
What's-
days. I thought Moses, I thought it was actually...
Moses was a lot longer in the desert, though, wasn't he?
Yeah. Jesus
No,
was
it
in
was 40 days and 40 nights.
Jesus was in
Okay.
40 days.
Just to be in the same room with Mrs. Stenson was like being caught in a downpour. She sure could drench a body with scripture. Picture that. But what she was saying now was far from holy. And if there was anything Mrs. Stenson was poor at, it was talking as she climbed full speed up a steep hill. By the time she reached us, she was so out of breath from the uphill scolding that she couldn't say a word. I looked around for Soup, but he was gone. Good old Soup. So there I stood with a sassafras stick in my hand and the apple juice spots on the front of my shirt. Still wet. The mortar in my shoes had now hardened into stone. My ears were ringing with a tinkle, tinkle, tinkle of smashing glass that wouldn't seem to stop. You, she said. Me? Her eyes burned with the wrath of the Old Testament. It was plain to behold that Mrs. Stenson believed that you had to smite transgressors so that the ground ran red with their blood until the multitudes were sore afraid, especially sore. But if anybody ever looked sore, it was Mrs. Stenson. Robert Peck, she said in full voice. Her big old hands shot out and grabbed my face and my hair. She shook me hard enough to shake off one of my shoes. Then, after she stopped shaking me, she twisted my head around so my nose was pointed right at the little black star on that broken window pane. Just look what you did, said Mrs. Stenson. Look me in the eye and tell the truth. Do you dare say you didn't? I didn't. This was not the response that she expected. I guess what she really thought was an outburst of guilt, a tear-soaked plea to ask for forgiveness of God and Mrs. Stenson. Perhaps not in that order. Not in that order of importance. I didn't, honest, Mrs. Stenson. I didn't throw an apple that far. Look how far it is. You did do it. I saw you do it. And here's the apple you did it with. She had a pierced apple in one hand and my switch in the other, and I knew I was a goner. But I couldn't hit the church from way up here. Nobody could. Bosh! Even a fool knows how far an apple will pitch from a stick. Watch! You won't believe what I saw. Mrs. Stenson somehow let go of her senses. She pushed an apple on a stick, and before I could grab her arm, her temper bested reason. Whoosh! You never saw a worse throw in your life. Not if you stood up in that old orchard from now until judgment. Her apple never even headed in the direction of the Baptist church. Nowhere near. But you couldn't say that apple didn't have any steam to it. No, sir, it flew off her stick, my stick, like a rifle ball, going east by northeast, and finally tipped over a flower pot with a geranium in it outside old Haskins' shack window, and the pot cracked the glass. Crash, tinkle. Out came old Mr. Hashkin with blood in his eye. His language did he really have blood in his eye, or was he just really, 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 really mad? He was really, really, really mad. Goodness. Talking with that voice is just like... No, I accidentally pressed the wrong button. His language would have made... out came Mr. Haskin with blood in his eyes. His language would have made Satan himself cover his ears. Not real fancy swearing, just a long string of old favorites. He pointed at Mrs. Stenson and me, then he started uphill, coming our way fast. Run! Yelled Mrs. Stenson. That man's a degenerate. We ran. Mrs. Stenson and I, she had on 2 shoes and I wore 1, which evened the speed a little bit. And we ran as if hell was a step behind. So they were saying they were running like they wanted to get to heaven, but they were super close to not heaven, right? We ran until we could no longer hear the terrible things that old Mr. Haskins shouted he would do if Mrs. Stenson the next time she came near his rotten old shack. We didn't stop running, Mrs. Stenson and I, until we darted into Frank Rooker's garage and had bolted the door. But as we ran in, Soup ran out after taking one look at Mrs. Stenson. Out the side door he shot into the arms of Mr. Haskin. Soup still had a switch in his hand, and his shirt front was smelled and spotted with apple juice, which was enough evidence for old Mr. Haskin. Borrowing the sassafras switch, the old man gave Soup a fine smarting. I'll have to admit it sure must have been a sight to see. From where Mrs. Stetson and I stood panting, we didn't see it, but we heard it all. Thinking I'd be next, I even winced for poor Soup with every blow. Best of all, we heard him confess up to breaking the window. Even though it wasn't the same glass he got thrashed for, in a way, it really was justice. Mrs. Stenson was right. There really is a God.